He never spoke during haircuts, just worked in silence with hands that never trembled. The old barber had been cutting hair for 30 years, and most customers assumed he was just another quiet small-town businessman. Until one afternoon, a young pilot noticed the faded tattoo on his forearm while getting a trim, and froze, because that mark was something only one group of men could wear, and very few of them had survived to tell about it. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this tale of silence, service, and forgotten wings, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who never asked to be honored. The barbershop sat on Main Street between Miller's Hardware and Betty's Diner, its red and white pole spinning lazily in the afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled of talcum powder and old leather, with jazz music playing softly from a radio that looked older than most customers. Frank Torres was 72, though he moved like a man 20 years younger. His hair had gone silver, his face bore lines of decades under the sun, but his hands remained steady as stone. He wore the same thing every day: black slacks, white button-down shirt, and a black apron washed so many times it felt soft as cloth. He opened at 8, closed at 6, and never took appointments. First come, first served, no exceptions. Most customers were locals, farmers, mechanics, the occasional businessman passing through. They'd tried making conversation over the years, asking about his family, hobbies, where he'd come from before opening shop. Frank would nod politely, sometimes offer a brief yes or no, but mostly he just cut hair, clean, precise cuts that looked exactly like what each customer asked for. The regulars had given up trying to chat. They'd learned to sit quietly, let Frank work, pay their $12, and leave. Some found it peaceful, others found it strange. But nobody complained about the haircuts. They were perfect every time. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. Frank was sweeping hair from his last customer when the door chimed. A young man stepped inside, maybe 25, wearing a clean white t-shirt and jeans. He was tall, lean, with posture that suggested military training. His hair was already short, military regulation, but growing out enough to need a trim. "Afternoon," the young man said, removing his baseball cap. "Got time for a quick cut?" Frank nodded toward the chair without speaking. The young man sat down, and Frank draped the cape around his shoulders with practiced efficiency. No small talk, no, "How do you want it cut?" Frank had seen enough military cuts to know what was needed. As Frank began, Jake stared at the reflection in the mirror, his mind racing. The 8th Air Force had suffered devastating losses during the war. Entire bomber crews were shot down over Germany, France, the Netherlands. The men who flew those missions had a life expectancy measured in weeks, not years. Most never made it home. Frank seemed to sense Jake's attention. He paused, looked at Jake in the mirror, and their eyes met for the first time since the haircut began. "You were air crew," Jake said quietly. It wasn't a question. Frank's hands stilled. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The jazz music continued playing. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, but something in the small barbershop had shifted. "B-17, Frank said finally. His voice was quiet, rusty from disuse. "Ball turret gunner." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The ball turret was arguably the most dangerous position on a B-17. Suspended beneath the aircraft in a transparent sphere, gunners were completely exposed, unable to wear parachutes, trapped if the landing gear was damaged. The mortality rate was staggering. "How many missions?" Jake asked. Frank resumed cutting, but his movements were slower now, more thoughtful. 25. Full tour." Jake knew what that meant. In 1943, completing 25 missions was considered nearly impossible. The statistics were brutal. For every 100 men who started their tour, only 24 would finish it. And Frank had been one of them. That's incredible," Jake said. "I've read about the 8th Air Force, what you guys went through." Frank worked in silence for several more minutes. Jake watched his face in the mirror, saw the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes seemed to be looking somewhere far beyond the reflection. "We lost a lot of good men," Frank said eventually. Better men than me. But you made it, Jake said. You survived. Frank's hands paused again. He looked at Jake in the mirror, and for a moment, Jake saw something in the old man's eyes. Pain, memory, a weight that had been carried for nearly 80 years. Survival ain't always a blessing, son, Frank said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Jake was only beginning to understand. He'd studied the war in books, seen documentaries, heard statistics. But sitting in this chair, looking at this quiet old man who had lived through humanity's darkest chapter, the reality of it hit him differently. Tell me about it, Jake said softly. If you want to, I mean. I'd like to hear. Frank finished the left side and moved to the right, his movements still precise but somehow gentler now. For a long time, Jake thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, so quietly Jake had to strain to hear, Frank began to speak. First mission was Schweinfurt, he said. August 17th, 1943. Ball-bearing factories. They told us it would cripple German industry, end the war faster. He paused, scissors still working. We called it Black Thursday later. Lost 60 bombers that day, 600 men. Jake remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell, might cause Frank to retreat back into his decades of silence. I was 19, Frank continued. Thought I was invincible, thought the war was an adventure. Took exactly one mission to cure me of that notion. His voice carried the weight of memory, each word carefully chosen. Saw a B-17 right next to us take a direct hit from flak. 1 second it was there, 10 men inside, next second it was pieces falling out of the sky. The haircut continued, but Jake was no longer thinking about his hair. He was seeing what Frank described, the massive formations of bombers, the deadly accurate German fighters, the flak bursts that could tear apart a flying fortress in seconds. The ball turret, Jake said carefully. What was it like? Frank's reflection showed the faintest smile, but there was no humor in it. Like being inside a fishbowl while someone throws rocks at it, he said. You're hanging underneath the plane in this little glass bubble, completely exposed. Can't wear a parachute, no room. If the hydraulics got hit and the turret jammed, you were trapped until they could hand crank you back up. If the landing gear was damaged, he didn't finish the sentence. Some gunners wouldn't get in the turret after their first mission, Frank continued, his voice steady but distant. Can't say I blamed them. Command would reassign them, call it combat fatigue. But I kept climbing back in. 24 more times. Jake watched Frank's hands continue their work, amazed at how steady they remained while recounting memories that would have broken most people. Why? He asked. Why keep going back? Frank paused in his cutting, meeting Jake's eyes in the mirror. Because somebody had to, and because the crew depended on me. You don't abandon your brothers, not when they're counting on you to watch their backs. Your crew, Jake said. What happened to them? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Frank resumed cutting, but Jake could see the change in his expression, a tightening around his eyes, a deepening of the lines on his forehead. Made it through all 25 missions together, Frank said finally. All 10 of us, rarest thing in the war, a crew that finished their tour intact. His voice softened. Called ourselves the Lucky Devils. Painted it right on the nose of our B-17, Sweet Caroline, named after our pilot's girl back home. Jake could hear the affection in Frank's voice when he mentioned his crewmates, could see how the memories of those men still lived vividly in the old Barber's mind. Tommy Sullivan was our pilot. Irish kid from Boston, couldn't have been more than 21, but flew that plane like he was born to it. Never panicked no matter how bad things got, and things got bad plenty of times. Frank moved to trim around Jake's ears, his movements automatic while his mind traveled back 8 decades. Bill Radar Henderson was our navigator. Called him Radar because he could find our way home in weather so thick you couldn't see the wingtips. Saved our lives more times than I can count when we had to find friendly airfields with shot-up engines and wounded crew. The shop filled with the quiet sounds of scissors and Frank's voice, creating an intimacy that Jake realized was probably the first time in decades that this story had been told. Our bombardier was Charlie Kowalski. Polish kid from Chicago who could drop bombs with surgical precision. He'd spend hours studying the target photos, calculating wind speed, altitude adjustments. Every bomb that misses the target, he used to say, is a bomb that might hit a school or a hospital. Took his job seriously. Frank's voice carried a warmth that Jake hadn't heard before. These weren't just war stories. These were memories of brothers, of young men who had faced hell together and somehow come through it. Then there was our top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Iron Mike O'Brien. Toughest son of a gun you ever saw. Got hit by shrapnel over Bremen, kept firing his guns while the medic worked on him. Never complained, never showed fear. And our tail gunner, Danny Rodriguez, kid had eyes like a hawk, could spot enemy fighters coming from miles away. Called out positions like he was announcing a baseball game. Jake found himself transported to that B-17, surrounded by these young men who had stared death in the face day after day and kept doing their jobs. Our radio operator was Jim Sparks Washington, only black man in our crew. The thing about combat, Frank continued, his voice taking on a reflective quality, is that it strips away everything except what really matters. Race, religion, where you came from, how much money your family had, none of that mattered at 30,000 feet with German fighters coming at you. All that mattered was whether you could count on the man next to you. Jake listened intently, understanding that he was hearing something precious, the testimony of a man who had witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. I remember one mission over Regensburg, Frank said, moving to clean up the neckline. Our number 3 engine got hit by flak, started burning. Tommy kept us in formation even though we were losing altitude, losing speed. The group was pulling ahead of us, leaving us vulnerable. Frank paused in his work, his eyes distant with memory. That's when you find out what kind of men you're flying with. Iron Mike could have bailed out. We all could have. But instead, he left his turret and helped Sparks try to put out that engine fire. Charlie left his bomb site to help treat Danny, who'd taken shrapnel in his leg. Every man on that plane could have saved himself, but nobody did. We all stayed to fight that fire and nurse that wounded bird home. Did you make it? Jake asked, though he knew the answer. Frank was here after all. Limped back to base on 3 engines with half our controls shot away, Frank said with a slight smile. Tommy set us down so gentle you'd have thought we were landing on silk. That's when I knew. These weren't just my crewmates anymore. They were my brothers. And brothers don't abandon each other. Frank brushed the loose hair from Jake's neck, his movements gentle and practiced, but Jake could see that something had changed in the old man's demeanor. The wall of silence he'd maintained for decades had developed cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. After the war, Jake asked carefully, what happened to them? To your crew? Frank's hands stilled for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, tinged with sadness. We promised we'd stay in touch, maybe have reunions. You know how it is with young men. You think you'll all live forever, that there'll always be time later. He resumed his work, but Jake could sense the weight of the story that was coming. Tommy went back to Boston, married his girl Caroline, the one our plane was named after, started a construction company, did real well for himself. Got a Christmas card from him every year for about 15 years. Then they stopped coming. Found out later he'd died in a car accident in 1962. 39 years old. Frank's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the pain in his eyes. Bill Henderson used his navigation skills to become a commercial airline pilot, flew for TWA for 30 years. We wrote letters back and forth for a while, comparing flying stories. He made it to retirement, moved to Florida, lost touch after that. Jake remained silent, understanding that Frank needed to tell this story, needed to honor the memory of his fallen brothers. Charlie Kowalski went to college on the GI Bill, became an engineer. Smart as a whip, that boy. Designed bridges all over the Midwest. Got word about 10 years ago that he'd passed. Cancer. He was one of the last ones I was still in contact with. The litany of loss continued, each name a weight that Frank had carried alone for decades. Iron Mike stayed in the military, made a career of it, served in Korea, then Vietnam, retired as a command sergeant major, tough as nails right up to the end, Heart attack took him in 1995. Went out the way he lived. Quick and no complaints. The Murphy twins stayed in Iowa, took over the family farm, Frank continued, his voice growing quieter with each name. They were inseparable in the war, stayed that way after. Patrick died first. Farming accident in 1978. Sean followed him 6 months later. Folks said he died of a broken heart, couldn't stand being separated from his twin brother. Frank set down his scissors and reached for the brush, beginning to sweep away the loose hair from Jake's neck and shoulders. But Jake could see that the old man's hands were trembling slightly now, not from age or infirmity, but from the emotional weight of recounting these memories. And then there was me, Frank said simply. Last one left, carrying all their stories, all their memories. Some days that feels like an honor, other days. He didn't finish the sentence. Jake sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Frank had shared. 9 lives, 9 stories, 9 brothers who had faced hell together and then scattered to the winds to live their separate lives. And Frank, the quiet barber in the small town, had been carrying all of them alone. Is that why you don't talk much? Jake asked gently. Because there's too much to remember. Frank met his eyes in the mirror, and Jake saw something there, a gratitude for being understood, for having someone who finally asked the right questions. Some things are too big for words, Frank said, and some things are too sacred to share with just anybody. These boys, my brothers, they deserved better than to become small talk in a barber shop. Jake understood then. Frank's silence hadn't been antisocial or unfriendly. It had been protective, reverent. He had been standing guard over the memories of 9 good men, keeping their stories safe until someone came along who was worthy to hear them. But you told me, Jake said. Frank nodded slowly. Because you understand what it means to trust your life to wings and sky. Because you know what it's like to climb into a machine that could kill you and trust that your training, your equipment, and your brothers will bring you home safe. Frank removed the cape from around Jake's shoulders and shook it out, a simple gesture that somehow felt ceremonial. Jake stood up, running his hand through his perfectly cut hair, but his attention was entirely on the old man who had just entrusted him with something precious. Thank you, Jake said, and Frank understood that he wasn't talking about the haircut. Thank you for listening, Frank replied. It's been a long time since I've had someone to tell it to. Jake reached for his wallet, but Frank held up a hand, just as he had with the first story. No charge, the old barber said firmly. Sir, I can't. You can, and you will, Frank said, but this time there was warmth in his voice, not just authority. Consider it professional courtesy, one airman to another. Jake hesitated, then nodded and put his wallet away. He extended his hand, and Frank shook it, a firm grip that conveyed respect, understanding, and something that might have been gratitude. Will you? Jake started, then paused. Would you mind if I came back? Not just for haircuts, but to talk? About flying, about the war, about whatever you want to share? Frank's weathered face showed the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much. As Jake headed for the door, Frank called after him. Lieutenant, Jake turned back. Take care of yourself up there, Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of worry for young men who climbed into flying machines and trusted them with their lives. The sky doesn't forgive mistakes. Yes, sir, Jake replied, understanding that he had just received advice from someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. After Jake left, Frank stood in the empty shop for a long time, staring at his reflection in the mirror. For the first time in decades, the silence didn't feel heavy or guarded. It felt peaceful, expectant, as if something had been waiting to be shared, and finally had been. He rolled up his sleeve and looked at the faded tattoo on his forearm, seeing it not as a reminder of pain and loss, but as a memorial to brotherhood, to sacrifice, to young men who had given everything for something larger than themselves. That evening, Frank closed the shop as usual, swept the floor, and locked the door. But before leaving, he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked to the small American flag decal in the corner of the mirror and straightened it carefully. Tomorrow he would open at 8 o'clock as he had for 30 years. But now, for the first time since 1994, He was looking forward to a customer's return. Word didn't spread quickly in Cedar Falls. It wasn't that kind of town. But over the next few weeks, Jake found himself mentioning the conversation to a few people. Not gossiping, not betraying confidences, but sharing in the way that important stories deserve to be shared. He told his commanding officer about finding a World War II veteran in town. He mentioned it to the base chaplain during a casual conversation about local history. He brought it up with a few of the older pilots who might appreciate the significance of what Frank had done. Each person Jake told reacted the same way, with quiet respect and a desire to know more. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Hughes, asked for Frank's full name and made a note in her calendar. The chaplain, Captain Robert Martinez, asked if Frank attended any local church and whether he might be interested in speaking to some of the younger airmen about military history. But it was Chief Master Sergeant William Thompson, a 30-year veteran with combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had the strongest reaction. "Ball turret gunner on a B-17? Thompson said, his voice filled with awe. "Jesus, Lieutenant, do you have any idea how rare that is? Those guys had a life expectancy measured in missions, not months, and he completed a full tour?" Jake nodded. 25 missions, lost more friends than I can count." Thompson was quiet for a long moment. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to do some research. A man like that, his service records might still exist somewhere. If they do, there might be commendations, unit citations, things he never talked about but that history should remember." Jake agreed, understanding that Thompson's request came from a place of respect, not curiosity. Meanwhile, Frank continued his routine. 8 to 6, Monday through Saturday, cutting hair in the same careful silence he'd maintained for decades. But something had changed. The weight of his solitude had lessened, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: connection. Jake returned the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. Sometimes he needed a haircut, sometimes he just stopped by to talk. Frank found himself looking forward to these visits, preparing stories he hadn't thought about in years, remembering details about his crewmates that he'd thought were lost forever. During one visit, Jake mentioned that some of the other airmen at the base had heard about Frank and would be honored to meet him. Frank's first instinct was to decline. He'd spent 30 years avoiding attention, avoiding questions about his service. But something about Jake's respectful approach, his genuine interest in hearing the stories rather than just collecting war stories, made Frank reconsider. "They're not looking for a show," Jake assured him. "They just want to pay their respects. Professional courtesy, one generation of airmen to another." Frank thought about it for several days. Finally, on a quiet Thursday afternoon when business was slow, he made a decision. "Tell them they can come by," he said to Jake, "but not all at once, 2 or 3 at a time, and I'm not giving speeches or presentations. If they want to talk, we talk. If they want to listen to an old man's memories, I'll share what I can." The first visitors came the following week: Chief Thompson and 2 young airmen, both pilots fresh out of training. They entered the shop quietly, respectfully, and Frank could see immediately that Jake had prepared them well. They weren't looking for entertainment or war stories to retell at parties. They came with the solemnity of people entering a sacred space. Frank cut their hair while they talked about flying, about the differences between then and now, about the constants that connected all military aviators across generations: the fear, the brotherhood, the responsibility of carrying other people's lives in your hands. As the weeks passed, more visitors came, always respectful, always in small groups, always genuinely interested in learning rather than just satisfying curiosity. Word had spread beyond the airbase to the local VFW post, to the American Legion, to the small community of veterans who understood the significance of what Frank represented. But it was Chief Thompson's research that brought the most surprising revelation. 3 weeks after Jake's first haircut, Thompson walked into the shop carrying a manila folder that looked official and important. "Frank," he said, they were on a first-name basis now, "I found something you need to see." Inside the folder were photocopied documents from the National Archives, Frank's service record, unit citations, mission reports. But it was the last document that made Frank's hands tremble as he held it. Distinguished Flying Cross, Thompson said quietly. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. Mission over Schweinfurt, August 17, 1943. Ball turret gunner Frank Torres continued manning his position despite severe air.